Good morning, everyone. I'm Jessica Weiner. I work in the Office of Health Equity and Health Disparities for the state of Nebraska. I will be kind of monitoring the chat and any questions you guys have during the presentation. If you want to just go ahead and put those in the chat box, or down below on your screen, there should be a Q&A feature. And then when we have the Q&A session at the end of the presentation, then I will be helping read those questions so you can get some answers. This breakout session goes over the Genoa Indian School Digital Reconciliation Project. And I will go ahead and let your panelists introduce themselves.
So my name is Margaret Jacobs, and I'm the co-director of the digital project we're going to discuss with you. I'm going to just share my screen with you right now so you can see the names of all of our presenters. My computer is being very slow, sorry about that. And I also wanted to begin by just acknowledging I'm speaking today from Lincoln, Nebraska, and I'm a professor of history and the director of the Center for Great Plains Studies at the University of Nebraska. And so for me, it's really important to acknowledge that, oh, I'm sorry about that. To acknowledge that the University of Nebraska is a land grant institution, and we have campuses and programs on the past, present, and future homelands of the Pawnee, Ponca, Oto-Missouri, Omaha, Dakota, Lakota, Kaw, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples, as well as those of the relocated Ho-Chunk, Sac, Fox, and Iowa peoples. So before I introduced everyone, I wanted to also acknowledge that we sit on native land. So our presentation today will include, my computer's just horribly slow today, sorry about this. There we go. My presentation today will include presentations from Judi Gaiashkibos. Judi is the longtime executive director of the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs, and she graciously agreed to be the co-chair of our project's Community Advisors Council, and she's been really instrumental in the founding of this project. And she's also a descendant of Genoa boarding school attendees, and she'll tell you a lot more about that later. Larry Wright Jr. is the chairman of the Ponca tribe of Nebraska, and he's also a member of our Community Advisors Council. He's also extremely active in the community in multiple ways. And myself, I am a non-native person. I should say Judy's a Ponca as well. I'm a non-native person. I'm the director of the Center for Great Plains Studies and a professor of history at UNL, and the co-director of the Genoa project. Before I tell you more about that project, I just want to give you the very briefest of introductions to the Genoa School. And if you were listening to Dr. Warren, you already learned a lot about boarding schools and their very long-term effects on Native peoples. And he mentioned the Genoa Indian School, which is located in Genoa, Nebraska. And this is the remaining building of the school today that is the headquarters of the museum and the Genoa Indian School Foundation, which is run by community volunteers in the town of Genoa. And it's in a pretty amazing place to go to. I would highly recommend that you make a trip out there and check out their website and Facebook page. So the Genoa School operated for 50 years, from 1884 to 1934. It was the fourth federal Indian boarding school, off-reservation school to open in the United States. The first opened in 1879 with Carlisle. It brought thousands of children, sometimes forcibly, against the will of their parents, against the consent of their parents. And as Dr. Warren mentioned, it was often done by withholding rations. And so families had to choose whether they would eat or whether they would send their children to school. Genoa actually had children from, we know, at least 40 different tribal nations, mainly on the Great Plains, but across the nation as well. Children who came to the school, the government kind of designed the school for, I would say, late middle school to high school age children, but some of the children who came were as young as 4, and some were as old as 22 that we know of. And there were hundreds of these boarding schools. Some were run by the government. There were about 25 off-reservation schools. There were about 100 more on-reservation schools. And there were a lot of boarding schools run by churches and missions. And this was the height of this era was the turn of the 20th century, the last couple decades of the 19th century and the first few decades of the 20th century. And as Dr. Warren mentioned, the point of these schools was all about assimilation. And as he quoted Colonel Pratt, who opened Carlisle Indian School, Pratt famously said, the purpose of the schools was to kill the Indian to save the man. So I found in some of my research, I've written a couple books on what I call indigenous child removal, which is what I see the boarding schools as, a form of family separation and indigenous child removal. And I found in some of my statistical research that about 78% of all Indian children were institutionalized in boarding schools in the year 1900. So that has a huge impact on communities and families. And the schools subjected to children to a very harsh institutional upbringing. They forced children to abandon their clothing and wear uniforms. They had to cut their hair. They forbid them from speaking their languages. They formed children into military companies. They had extremely harsh discipline for the children, extremely harsh corporal punishment. And they, for half of each day, the children learned in a classroom the fundamentals of an elementary education, reading, writing, and arithmetic. But for the other half of the day, the children were expected to labor. And some of the labor was done on behalf of the school. They were their own launderers. They were their own cooks. They were tending livestock in the field. They were also sometimes trained in manual occupations like this one in the school in blacksmithing. And then they were what was called outed to local farm families to work for those families at a really low wage. And about 2/3 of their wages were put into trust funds. And many Indian people have never seen those trust funds ever again. So as I mentioned, as a professor, I had studied, and as a historian, I had studied child removal and especially the boarding schools for a long time. And I wanted to do more as a scholar than just study this and write about it. I started to follow the Truth and Reconciliation Commission proceedings that were going on in Canada around their Indian residential schools. And they had a very similar system to the United States with very similar consequences and legacies. And I started to think, well, what could I do as a scholar to support some sort of reparation, reconciliation for the schools? And, you know, as a historian, one skill I have is I can go into the archives and find documents. And I wanted to think, how could I be of service to the Native families who had attended the schools, and also increase public awareness for non-Natives about what the schools meant and how they have lingering long-term effects. And so back in 2017, I reached out to Judi Gaiashkibos about starting a project like this, knowing that she had a close connection with the school. And I reached out to a wonderful professor in the libraries named Liz Lorang, who has incredible skill in creating digital projects. And we applied for some grants from the Council on Library and Information Resources and the National Endowment for the Humanities. And we were able to create a website, a project called the Genoa Indian School Digital Reconciliation Project. And we wanted all aspects of this project to be as indigenous as possible. We, with the guidance of our Community Advisors Council, especially Judi, we hired Henry Payer, who's a Ho-Chunk or Winnebago artist, to help us design the website. These are his beautiful collages on the website on either side of the photograph. And if you look really closely at them, you'll see the collage covers writing from some of the government documents. And by the way, I'm just sharing screenshots with you of our website. And later I will put into the chat the link to our website so you can go and look at it yourselves. And Henry Payer also helped us design this incredible logo on the left. And you can see here, this is really our mission, is bringing history home. The school was built on the land of the Pawnee people, and we want to honor them. And we want to honor the thousands of children who attended the school. This was a difficult childhood for many of them, not to say that there weren't moments of joy and pleasure as well, but the school was a harsh place. And we wanted to create this digital site as a place not only to honor those descendants and their communities, but also a place where they can do some research into their history. Mostly what's up there right now are government documents. These government documents are really hard to find for Genoa. They're scattered all over the United States in multiple national, federal repositories. And then there's some in tribal communities. In the future, we also hope to supplement all these government records with lots of oral histories of descendants. We have some audio recordings and video recordings that we also want to make available to the public as well. I think Judi wanted to talk later about this logo, so I'm not going to talk too much about it right now, just that Henry Payer did this amazing job of, I think, conveying the transformative nature or the transformative intention of the boarding schools. We can come back to this slide later when Judi talks, if she would like, and look at this some more. So it's really important to all of us that we had a Community Advisors Council. I have come very strongly to believe in the adage, I don't know if you all have heard this adage, nothing about us without us. And that's an adage, I don't know who coined that, but it's something I hear from a lot of Native American community leaders and activists and other scholars. And I think it's so apt because there was just such a long era in which scholars like me, who are non-Native, were writing books about Native people, were doing projects on them, were studying them with very little input from Native people about how they were portrayed, and no questions to them about the accuracy of what scholars like me were finding in the archives and government documents. So from the beginning, we've been really concerned that this project have as much guidance, as much direction from Native people. And Judi, again, has been really instrumental in this. And she suggested that we have representatives from each of the 4 headquartered tribes in Nebraska, plus a representative of the Pawnee Nation. And so Larry Wright Jr., who will be speaking later, has been with the project from the beginning as a representative of the Ponca tribe. Judi's been our co-chair of our Community Advisors Council. James Wrightingin of the Pawnee Nation has been the other co-chair, and he's been with the project from the beginning. I don't think we have a photo of him. Stuart Red Wing on the far left is our representative from the Santee Sioux. And then I don't think in this picture we have any representatives pictured from the Winnebago or Omaha tribes, but in this other picture, when we had our meeting at the school in Genoa, you'll see some of our other representatives there. And the project has employed a lot of people too. We've made it our intention to hire as many Native students as possible on the project. And I can speak to any more questions you might have about that later. I did want to just focus a tiny little bit on the health issues at the school. So one of the ways that you can search our site is by topic. And we chose topics that we saw coming out of the documents all the time. So there was lots of things about how the children came to Genoa, how they left Genoa, lots of runaways from the school. There's so much about discipline and punishment. Of course, there's so much that the documents reveal about children's families. And I think for people doing research on their own families, they're going to find a wealth of information there. There's a lot on the children's labor and their outing to families. But a huge topic is on health, disease, and mortality. These were a constant concern and a constant problem at the schools. So if you're interested in learning more about the health issues that were present at the schools, one of the ways you can do that is just by looking at student applications. Every student, this is an example, I apologize if this is a little bit blurry, but as I mentioned, I'll provide a link later. But the applications, they all included this medical certificate so that you could go and look at all of the applications if you wanted to see the kinds of things that the children were facing. And they have questions about whether the children have chickenpox, diphtheria, measles, tuberculosis, etc. And if you wanted to study sort of historically what Indian health was like, these would be a great resource
Somehow
for you.
I'm off the screen here.
And finally, I just want to end with this, a couple other letters that give you an indication of what the healthcare issues were like in the schools. So the schools were not supposed to accept sick children. They were not supposed to be over capacity, but the schools were given money for every student they had that attended. And so they had a real incentive to pack the schools very tightly. Many of them were far more than the capacity they were set for. But so these two letters are kind of interesting. On the left, a physician is from Rosebud, South Dakota, is about to send a child to school. And he attests that the child is physically able to attend Genoa. And then just a week later, the superintendent of the Genoa school writes that the child was suffering from an active case of loathsome disease, which he did not specify what that was. But diseases like flu and trachoma, diphtheria, tuberculosis, whooping cough spread rapidly through the schools, spread rapidly at Genoa as well as the others. And these kinds of documents show that the poor health and disease was an omnipresence at all of the schools. And I think that's a troubling enough aspect of the schools, that they actually undermined Native people's health, Native children's health, rather than enhanced it. But of course, as Dr. Warren talked about, there were other much more long-term health effects in a more holistic sense. And I'm going to turn it over now to Judi and Larry to talk about the much more sort of personal side of this. So thank you very much. And I'm really happy you're all here today. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Margaret, for that great introduction. Can you all hear me? I'm unmuted, correct? Yes. I'm Judi Gaiashkibos, and I've been the director of the Commission on Indian Affairs for 25 years. And so when Margaret came to me with this opportunity to explore getting funding to support telling this story, I thought it was really, really long overdue. And as we heard from Dr. Warren this morning, for equity, you have to have the truth. And the truth is through the stories and the voices of the people from the past. And I'm honored to descend. My mother went to the Genoa Indian School. And so I'm here as someone that's still alive. And the motto was to kill the Indian, save the man. And so we're thankful that they didn't kill us, and the spirit of the Native people and the voice is still alive. My mother's mother was Santee, and I'm in Roponka, but my grandmother was born in 1890, and she grew up on the Santee Reservation and went to another boarding school of sorts, the Santee Normal Training School that was located on the reservation. And luckily, she didn't have to be segregated from her family, and she got to speak her language. But in the case of my mother, she and her two sisters went to Genoa, where they were separated as much as possible, and by speakers of their language. So you kill a culture by killing the language. So they robbed my mother and her sisters of their language. Now, they still spoke their language to some degree, but it was rather challenging. So when my mother went back home to the reservation, at a time when non-Indian women didn't have a lot of opportunities, my mother was on the tribal council for the Ponca people. And she learned a lot at the Genoa Indian School. As Margaret said, half the day was spent learning the 3 R's, and the other half the day was spent learning a trade. My mother's trade that she learned was to be a cook, a baker, a chef. So she made a lot of the bread. Her specialty was cinnamon rolls that the kids ate at the school. And the children were, in essence, kind of like slave labor. And they really never had enough to eat. They were often hungry. I learned much of this after my mother's death, and she died when I was 19. So she didn't talk a lot about what all that went on at the school. Mostly what she told me were the more positive stories. But as Dr. Warner said, and when you look at those photos that he had on, and Margaret showed some of those photos as well, the children don't look very happy. They look sad, lonely. I saw a couple smiling in the picture that Margaret put on the screen, so that was a little bit encouraging. But overall, it was going from a family, a home life where you were with your extended family, to a military school. That was a real stark, drastic change, and not getting to be so close to people. They were segregated, and they were distanced by tribal affiliation. So to break down the language, and they had to, many in the early years when they first opened Genoa in 1884, they were literally kidnapped and taken there and forced to cut their hair off, etc. By the time my mother went there in the 20s, that wasn't the case. It was a bit more civilized, but still the goal was to kill the Indian, to discount for everything that you learned at home, your tribal ways, that was all wrong. Your ceremonies, they were to have no value. You were to become an American of sorts, but not have your tribal identity. So that was really tragic, and it was really detrimental. And it, as we heard, carries on through historic grief. And so today I'm a living product of the Genoa Indian School. And sometimes there are things that go in my mind that were carried through my mother, what she learned at the school, and perfectionism. Things are never good enough. My mother and grandmother always said that white people always will look at your shoes, make sure they're polished, and your hair. How does your hair look? And you saw in some of those photos where they took the Navajo man and cut his beautiful hair and tried to turn him into a short-haired American. And that was really genocide in robbing us of who we were as the first peoples of Nebraska and of the United States of America. I do want to acknowledge my colleague, friend, Dr. James Wright, who is the father-in-law to Dr. Warren. And I've been friends with James for 27 years, and he has been a great part of this whole project. And he is from the Pawnee Nation, and the school was built there on Pawnee land. So you saw that harness building. That's one of the few buildings left at the Genoa Indian School. There are a couple barns left over there. So if you go to Genoa today, you won't see much of what was the school was like. It would be similar to in Nebraska here, Nebraska Wesleyan's campus, about that size. And so for some people, it did give them an opportunity to learn a trade, as my mother did. And but it also did a lot of harm to their well-being, and they carried a lot of that pain. So today, through this project, what we hope is that the descendants and all Americans can learn what happened with this failed experiment to kill the Indian and turn us into a cookie cutter American. It was a disaster. And this project, I think, allows people to go online and drill down, read the letters, see. Most of the letters have a real negative tone to them. And maybe Margaret can read one of those letters in a bit here. It was always the children were bad. Why did they run away from the school? And if you don't send them back, their lives will be doomed, because you can only succeed if you learn our ways. And remember, there was a cemetery at the school. Most schools that children went to didn't have a cemetery. So thinking of how many children had classmates that died and were buried at the school, how sad that must have been. Simultaneously, they were teaching them, they had operas, and there were some famous people that came out of the boarding schools. There was Gertrude Simmons Bonin, who wrote an opera, and Jim Thorpe, who was an Olympian and a wonderful athlete. And Genoa had a very prestigious basketball team, and they played the boys around the area, the other teams in the area, and they were known to be fierce competitors. So I guess I would just close my little remarks to say that I'm grateful for my ancestors, their strength, their resilience, and I'm so honored that I can bring to light of day the truth about what happened at Genoa, and that going forward, we can help our policymakers, whether that's at DHHS, the legislature, the governor, the federal government, understand that they really do have treaty obligations to address health issues that are linked directly to what happened at the Genoa Indian School. So at this time, then, I would like to introduce the chair of my board of the Indian Commission and the chairman of my tribe, the Honorable Chairman Larry Wright, Jr.
Thank you, Judy. Thanks everybody for joining us this morning. And my name is Larry Wright, Jr. I'm the chairman of the Ponca Tribe of Nebraska, and it's an honor to be here and sharing on this topic with everybody today. I really got involved with this project and became very interested in what was going on here about 4 years ago. Actually, next week it will be 4 years to exactly. 4 years ago, the Ponca Tribe of Nebraska, with our relatives from the Ponca Tribe of Oklahoma, we did a restoration remembrance walk that went from our homelands in Niobrara down to Barneston, Nebraska. Some land was gifted to the tribe and was on the historic trail that when the Ponca people were forcibly removed from Nebraska to Oklahoma. A segment of that trail was dedicated and donated to the Poncas, and we did a coordination remembrance walk along that route and followed the Blue River, and Genoa was along that path. And along that route that we undertook at that time, one of our stops was in Genoa, and our people actually visited the school, and it was very moving in a good and but mostly bad way to see our elders that were able to visit at that time, who were along the walk with us, who we're looking at the archives and pictures there at the school, and just to see how emotional it was for them, and how many direct, close relatives that they all had, that the pictures were there, and they were telling stories that that were shared with them or that they knew, and just to see the impact that that had on them. And then as they sat there and visited, hearing the stories of the other boarding schools that they went to, my aunts, uncles, and some cousins that were there during that time, and to hear their stories, and understanding the pain that this caused, not only for them but for others, but also to hear them laugh and tell some of the things that happened to them or things they did at their own boarding schools. And as a follow-up to that, I was asked to be on the advisory committee, and wanted to be involved with that, and having the opportunity to look at primary documents about names that are, Ponca names that are well known, and know that we still have those relatives here yet today. As an ex social studies teacher, history teacher, that really resonated with me as well, to make sure that our stories are being told by us. And as was mentioned earlier, for much of history, others have told the stories of our Indian people, and without strong voices from us involved from the very beginning. And I thought there was a real good opportunity to do that here, and make sure that as this is shared, that while there were good things and maybe even good intentions, that we couldn't forget the actual voice of our people. And we have descendants today, as Judi talked about, her own mother was there. And so there's both good and bad. And we can't gloss over the bad for the sake of the good, and the historical trauma that boarding schools in general have created for our Native people, and the continued struggles that many of our Native people have yet today with schools, and all of this tells a story, and gives people understanding of what was forced upon Indian people at that time. And so I think the work that the committee has done, the work that those that have worked daily to digitize the documents, the primary documents, and everything that they've had to do to go and do that, and go through all of those stored paper documents to get them into a format that is able to be shared, so that all of the different tribal nations that were represented at just this school was surprising to me, to see how far students came to be here, and that impact. And for those tribes that as far as way as Wisconsin and other states, me as a Ponca can't share those stories or tell those stories like they can. And so to be able to invite everybody to be part of this, and have an opportunity to help shape the narrative, and share those primary voices that along with the primary documents, I think was very crucial for me, and what made me committed to the work that was being done, and just understanding what that had as an impact on Poncas in particular, from my purview as tribal chairman, and understanding the history that my own tribal nation has gone through forced relocation, and then our people coming back, and the trial of Standing Bear, and what that meant for Indian people as a whole in this country, to the Poncas, the Ponca tribe of Nebraska being terminated in the 60s, and going through federal recognition again. And for the last 30 years, we have been a tribal nation, rebuilding what was lost. And unfortunately, one of the things that the boarding school experience helped exacerbate was a loss of language and culture. And when you have that on top of our termination, that had huge consequences that we are still trying to recover from today. And the loss of our language, the loss of our culture is paramount to who we are. And one of the things that we continue to fight every day. And it's very tough in this day and age when languages as a whole are in jeopardy. In my tribe, we've declared a state of emergency, and that's been the case for about 5 years. I made that declaration as tribal chairman, and that stands until we make significant progress to get that back. But it's very hard to do, and especially as we continue to lose elders and fluent speakers, but it is one that our people are committed to. And it's, that's part of the story of the boarding school experience for our people. And as many times as, and many examples of the good that came out of it. And I would say, a backtrack several years ago, I went through a program while I was getting my master's degree, and we actually went to the Nebraska Historical Society and went through an exercise where they were showing these ribbons and all these first place ribbons and medals, and we're talking about all these things, and they did it without context, but they had us as students guess and make observations and to decide where these ribbons came from. And it turned out that these were all first place ribbons that were earned through different agricultural and skills that were taught at Genoa, but they were in competition with non-natives, and these students at the Indian school were winning first place. And I forget how many it was, but I know it was. I know there was over 15 different first place ribbons over a course of time, and so it made me proud at that time even to know that in those kind of harsh conditions where they're forcibly separated from family in many cases. Obviously, that's not every case, but and here you have these students going through very hard conditions, but have learned skills that would make them compete and excel and exceed people that were not native at that time. And so as a native person, that made me proud that in spite of all the bad, they were able to have some good that come out of that. And so that's been my experience with this, and just understanding when you look at the different boarding schools in the Great Plains region and the Indian schools that were affiliated with different areas of Christianity, and you go and you look at places like the Flandreau Indian School and what that was like then and now today. And so it's a real interesting history when you are able to look at all of those collectively, and really helps remind us of what the intent was, as was shared, to kill the Indian and save the man, and all of the other forms of sanctioned genocide, for lack of a better term, that was put on Indian people, from blood quantum to all of these things to try and get rid of the Indian in every facet. And as we continue to prove, that's just not going to be done. Our people are resilient, and some of you may have heard that we're the seeds that our relatives have planted. We're the seeds of resistance, and we're here, and we're growing we're becoming stronger, and in spite of the experience, but in many cases because of that experience. And we know now more today than ever that our Native people need to succeed in the dominant culture and learn those skills from an education standpoint, but also from the skill set of trades and et cetera, which they were trying to teach at that time. In order for us to protect our tribal nations, protect our culture, gain all of those things for the generation that's here and for our next generations, our young and those that haven't been born yet. And so I think that's when we look at this collectively, that we take that experience, we remember it, we grow from it, and it will continue to make our tribal nations stronger. And with that, I'll stop in case there's any other questions. Thank you.